Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's hearing on the Congressional Budget Office's budget and economic outlook. At the outset, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time. Without objection, so ordered. Now, before I welcome our witness, I will go over a few housekeeping matters. Today, the committee is meeting virtually. Before we begin, I would like to remind members participating in this proceeding to keep your camera on at all times, even if you are not under recognition by the chair. Members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. If you choose to participate in a different proceeding, please turn your camera off. Members are responsible for their own microphones. Please mute your microphones when you are not speaking. This will help prevent feedback and other technical issues. Please remember to unmute yourself when you seek recognition. Note that the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. We are not permitted to unmute members unless they explicitly request assistance. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask if you would like staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. They will not unmute your microphone under any other conditions. I'd like to remind members that we have established an email inbox for submitting documents before and during committee proceedings, and we have distributed that email address to your staff. Now I will introduce our witness. This morning we will be hearing from Dr. Philip Swagel, the Director of the Congressional Budget Office. I'll now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning. I want to thank Dr. Philip Swagel, Director of the Congressional Budget Office, for appearing before our committee today to testify on CBO's newly released Budget and Economic Outlook, also known as the CBO baseline. Dr. Swagel, your agency is an indispensable partner to Congress and to the House Budget Committee, and in particular, and I want to thank all your dedicated staff for their hard work in putting out this report. We're holding this committee hearing a little later in the year than usual since Congress did not complete the fiscal year 2022 appropriations bills until March. And CBO needed those final funding levels to finish the outlook. But today's hearing is still a great opportunity for us to examine CBO's new projections for the next decade as Congress begins the FY 2023 budget and appropriations process. When comparing CBO's new outlook with the one published shortly after President Biden took office, one thing is abundantly clear. The American Rescue Plan delivered critical life-saving and life-changing relief that changed the course of the pandemic, rescued our economy, and helped American families and small businesses stay afloat. The American Rescue Plan helped power a historic recovery, the most equitable in recent memory, and contributed to the largest job growth ever in a calendar year. The percentage of people receiving unemployment insurance has now fallen below 1% for the first time in more than 50 years. The unemployment rate is currently down to 3.6%, a level that prior to the rescue plan, CBO projected we would not reach during the entire decade. Now CBO is projecting that the unemployment rate will drop even further in 2023 to 3.5%, the lowest rate our country has seen in nearly 70 years. Small businesses, which account for nearly half of all American jobs, are booming. Americans submitted 5.4 million applications for new businesses in 2021, the most in recorded history, and small businesses are creating more jobs than ever before. The rescue plan nearly doubled our GDP growth in 2021. As a result, the U.S. was the first major advanced economy in the world to come back above pre-pandemic levels of GDP. Faster economic growth has boosted hiring and wages and powered record deficit reduction. CBO projects we're on track to see the deficit shrink by 1.7 trillion from 2.8 trillion in 2021 to 1.1 trillion this year. All of these indications are evidence of the same truth. Our economy is far outpacing what CBO projected without the rescue plan. The rescue plan laid the foundation for America's unprecedented recovery and economic resilience, and we are in a far better place because of it. We've made incredible progress, but inflation is our new challenge. I will reiterate what economic experts across the ideological spectrum have said over and over. International supply chain bottlenecks and higher energy costs due to Russia's war in Ukraine are the primary drivers of current inflation. These are global problems, which is why inflation is a global issue. In fact, inflation in the UK hit a 40-year high just last week. 38 member countries of OECD are averaging an inflation rate of more than 9%. Clearly, this inflation is not unique to the United States, but the American Rescue Plan is. Because we enacted this legislation, American families, state and local governments, and our national economy are facing this new challenge from a position of economic strength. But additional action is necessary to protect Americans from rising costs and keep our economy strong. The Federal Reserve is best positioned to tackle immediate inflation concerns, and Congress can and must do everything it can to lower costs to American families overall. The cost of healthcare, housing, education, childcare, the basic needs of American families have been rising for decades. That's why House Democrats have passed legislation to lower prescription drug prices, expand the supply of affordable housing, cut childcare costs, expand access to higher education, and ensure that big corporations cannot take advantage of American consumers with excessive price hikes. These actions would lower families' monthly costs substantially, and I look forward to discussing this today with Director Swagel. This is an important hearing and an important time for the future of our nation. I hope that today we can focus on the facts and on solutions that will deliver relief to American families and build a stronger, more equitable, and more resilient economy. Director Swagel, thank you again for appearing before our committee today, and I look forward to your testimony. With that, I would like to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Smith, to unmute his microphone for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My opening statement probably couldn't be any more different than the comments you had just made. The budget and economic outlook released by the Congressional Budget Office yesterday shows the impact of one-party Democrat rule in Washington over the past year. And it's not a pretty picture. In short, America's fiscal health is getting worse. And when we compare it to CBO's February 2021 baseline, you can see just how much the nation's budgetary and economic outlook has deteriorated since President Biden and the one-party Democrat rule has taken over. First, let's look at the data. When President Biden entered office, CBO predicted the government would spend $61 trillion over the next 10 years. Now they say it will be $72 trillion. When Biden entered office, CBO predicted the government would run up just over $12 trillion in deficits over the next 10 years. Now they say it will be close to $16 trillion. When Biden entered office, CBO predicted the government would spend $4.6 trillion on interest payments over the next 10 years. Now they say it will be over $8 trillion. When Biden entered office, CBO predicted the average interest rate to be 2.5% over the next 10 years. Now they say it will be 3.5%. Their prediction for this year has nearly doubled from 1.3% to 2.4%. The inflation forecast for 2022 and 2023 combined is 64% higher than what CBO predicted when Biden entered office. And that might be overly optimistic. After all, CBO projects inflation to be 4.7% this year, but inflation has already increased by almost 4% in 2022. Also, perhaps overly optimistic, CBO's economic growth predictions, real GDP growth is projected to be 3.1% this year, but GDP declined by 1.4% in the first quarter of 2022. Under every metric, President Biden has worsened the balance sheet of the federal government, the economic outlook for our country, and the fiscal health of American families. So how did we get here? Democrats passed their $2 trillion American Rescue Plan, even though the economy was well on its way to recovery. Democrats promised it would create 4 million jobs. Instead, job creation was smaller in 2021 than CBO had projected it would be before the passage of the $2 trillion plan. When it did create was the highest inflation in 40 years, while spending federal tax dollars on such things as $17 million on a golf course in Florida, $4 million to build beach parking lots in South Carolina, $2 million to plant trees in New York, and $400 billion to pay people to stay at home and not go to work. And yet things could have been even worse. The Washington Democrats' Build Back Broke agenda would have added $5 trillion in new spending and $3 trillion in new debt, according to CBO. There's a silver lining in the CBO baseline, though. Thanks to the Republicans' passed Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the tax burden on families and job creators fell while federal revenues have grown. This year, revenue from corporations and individual taxpayers is up, far exceeding what CBO projected the federal government would collect. Revenues have surged 39% over last year, and collections are on pace to be the largest share of GDP in American history. As a matter of fact, if current forecasts hold, revenues could very well end up being more than $1.5 trillion above what CBO predicted they would be for 2022 after passage of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. The story this baseline tells us is the story of one-party Democrat rule in Washington. After 1 year, we have trillions more in spending, an explosion of new debt, record inflation, a supply chain crisis, and the highest gas prices ever recorded. And now a baby formula shortage? This is the legacy of President Biden's first year in office. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for his opening statement. In the interest of time, I ask that any other members who wish to make a statement submit their written statements for the record in the email box we established for receiving documents before and during committee proceedings. We have distributed that email address to your staff. I will hold the record open until the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not yet have prepared written statements. Once again, I want to thank Dr. Swagel for being here this morning. The committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. You have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks. You may unmute your microphone and begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee for inviting me to testify on the CBO's budget and economic outlook. In CBO's projections released yesterday, the federal budget deficit in 2022 is $1 trillion. That shortfall represents a substantial reduction from deficits in the past 2 years as federal spending in response to the coronavirus pandemic wanes and as the current economic expansion continues. In our projections, which reflect the assumption that current laws governing federal taxes and spending generally remain unchanged, federal deficits nonetheless remain large by historical standards and generally increase over the next decade. From 2023 to 2032, the annual shortfall averages $1.6 trillion. The projected deficit of more than $2 trillion in 2032 at the end of the budget window would equal 6.1% of GDP. That's well above the average for the past 50 years. Outlays average 23% of GDP over the next 10 years, and rising interest rates and accumulating debt cause net interest costs to double as a percentage of GDP by 2032. And at the same time, the aging population and the rising cost of healthcare contribute to increased mandatory spending. In 2022, revenues in our projections reached their highest level as a share of GDP in more than 2 decades. They then decline over the next few years, but remain above their long-term average through 2032. Outlays grow faster than revenues over that period, which is why deficits increase. Federal debt held by the public initially dips to 96% of GDP in 2023 and then rises after that. In our projections, the debt ratio reaches 110% of GDP in 2032, that's the highest level ever, and then rises to 185% of GDP in 2052 at the end of our 30-year long-term outlook. We aim for our projections to fall in the middle of the range of likely outcomes. Still, they are subject to considerable uncertainty, in part because of the ongoing pandemic and because of other world events, such as the invasion of Ukraine and lockdowns in China, and so on. Our estimate of the deficit for 2022 is now $118 billion less than what we had projected last July in our most recent update before this one. In the current update, in the current estimate for 2022, revenues are 10% higher than we had previously projected, and outlays are up by 6%. The cumulative deficit over the 2022 to 2031 period is $2.4 trillion more than it was last summer. Newly enacted legislation since last July accounts for most of that increase. There's other changes that boost projected revenues and therefore reduce deficits. Those are mostly offset by economic changes that increase outlays, particularly for interest payments and Social Security payments. Let me now turn very briefly to the economy. The pace of inflation since the middle of last year has been the fastest in 4 decades. In CBO's projections, elevated inflation persists in 2022 because of the combination of strong demand and restrained supply in the markets for goods, services, and labor. In response, the Federal Reserve tightens monetary policy and interest rates rise rapidly. Real GDP, that is GDP adjusted to remove the effects of inflation, grows by 3.1% this year, and the unemployment rate averages 3.8% in our projections. After 2022, economic growth slows and inflationary pressures ease. So CBO has published a great deal of information yesterday about our new projections. Those are online on the CBO website. And with that, thank you again. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Director Swagel, for your opening remarks. We will now begin our question and answer session. As a reminder, members can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and responses will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so by sending them electronically to the email inbox we have established within 7 days of the hearing. Now we'll begin our questioning. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for 5 minutes.
I thank the distinguished chair for your continued leadership and convening this hearing, and Director Swagel, thank you for your presence and for the work that you do. I want to associate myself with the comments of Chairman Yarmouth when he made clear that the American Rescue Plan rescued the economy at a time when it was on the brink of collapse and put us into position to achieve some of the significant economic growth measures that have occurred at this particular point in time, as well as the record unemployment. And so I just want to clarify some things that you have previously testified to, so we got a real understanding as to where things are at right now. Now, I believe you previously testified that revenues in the CBO's projections would reach their highest level as a share of GDP in more than 2 decades. Is that right?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And in fact, they are projected to increase to 20% of GDP in 2022, which I believe is up about 17% from the previous forecast. That's right.
The revenues will reach just slightly under 20%, which is up very substantially from our previous projections.
And we've seen approximately 8.3 million jobs created since President Biden first took office. Is that right?
Yes, employment has grown, very sharply as the U.S. has come out of the pandemic. As you said, since the beginning of 2021.
And is it your understanding that 8.3 million jobs that were created, that's a record in American history for a similar point in time in terms of a president's new administration?
Yes, that would be the most jobs created in a single year. So that's over the 2021, the first year of the administration.
Am I correct that the number of people relying on unemployment benefits has dropped to the lowest level since 1970?
The number of people collecting unemployment benefits, it's dropped very substantially. I don't know offhand if it's the lowest, but I suspect it might well be. It's with the rebound and the very strong, very tight labor market, we've seen lots of good outcomes, like you just mentioned.
And last year, how many new businesses were created in the United States of America?
There's the rebound from the pandemic has led to a surge in business creation. Obviously we saw businesses go out when the economy locked down, and then a huge number have been created. I don't know the number of millions offhand, but it's been a historic increase in business formation and entrepreneurship.
As my understanding, that approximately 5.4 million new businesses were created in the last year, as you indicated, a substantial return of American entrepreneurship. In terms of deficit reduction, because my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I thought were deficit hawks and cared about the deficit. That's all we heard about, certainly during the Tea Party years. Am I correct that in President Biden's first year, the deficit was reduced by more than $350 billion? Is that correct?
Yes, the deficit has gone down very substantially, both from last year to this year, and compared to what CBO had projected, leaving aside the new legislation that's been enacted.
And what is the projected deficit reduction for this current year that we're in?
The deficit is falling by its it's 1.8. It's about $1.8 trillion lower. It's going from last year's about $2.8 trillion to a deficit this year of $1 trillion. So that's a reduction of $1.8 trillion from 21 to 22.
So thank you for your testimony. For the life of me, we certainly have issues that we need to deal with in terms of inflationary pressures, which, as you've indicated, result from an increase in demand. That happens when you have a booming economy, and supply chain constraints, which happens when you have an economy that has to shut down as a result of a once-in-a-century pandemic. These are challenges that, of course, we continue to work on. We also continue to work on the issue as it relates to the baby formula shortage. I was shocked that so many of my Republican colleagues chose to vote against the appropriations legislation that was brought to the floor. But for the life of me, I can't figure out the doom and gloom that is going to be painted by some of my Republican colleagues. Thank you for your testimony and presenting the facts in a straightforward fashion. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now yield 10 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri, the ranking member, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To start here for the record, Director, if you can give me these answers as quickly as possible, I want to try to get through as much as possible. But I want to hit on the deficit reduction that was just before you and the joke of the comments, and I want you to clarify. Is it true that the fiscal year 21 deficit was $517 billion higher than where the Congressional Budget Office projected for the 2021 year?
Right. Our deficit, the deficit projection from last July to this one, yes, is higher.
So that's not a deficit reduction. And Biden's $2.78 trillion deficit in 2021 was the second highest in the history of America, driven in large part by his unpaid for $2 trillion American Rescue Plan. Is that correct?
Yes, the emergency spending during the pandemic, including the American Rescue Plan, drove the deficit last year. That is correct.
And so Biden's claimed fiscal year 22, a $1.5 trillion in deficit reduction, is only because last year his inflationary $2 trillion ARP, American Rescue Plan, drove government spending to 30.5% of GDP, 10% higher than the historic average. His latest fiscal year 23 budget proposes annual deficits averaging $1.6 trillion a year. Director, in February 2021, your baseline showed $61 trillion in government spending over the next 10 years. You now say it will be $72 trillion, correct?
Yes, that is correct over the next 10 years.
Okay, so that's 11 trillion higher, correct?
Yep.
So in February 2021, your baseline showed just over $12 trillion in deficits over the next 10 years. You now say it will be close to 16 trillion in deficits, correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yes.
Got it. So 3.5 trillion more in deficits. And in February 2021, you said the first interest rate hikes wouldn't come till 2024, correct?
In our economic projection, a year ago, that's correct.
Yes. Okay. Got it. Of course, now we have seen the Fed already increase rates twice in the last 6 months. And in February 2021, you said the government would spend 4.6 trillion on interest payments over the next 10 years. You now say it will be over 8 trillion, correct?
That is correct. It's both interest rates are higher and the amount of debt has gone up as well.
So based on every indicator we are looking at here, the administration is failing the American people. Your baseline projects inflation to be 4.7% this year, but inflation has already increased by almost 4% in 2022, making it highly likely we exceed 4.7%. To hit 4.7% inflation, we could not exceed 1% total for the remainder of the year. When were the GDP and inflation projections included in this baseline made?
So we locked our economic forecast at the very beginning of March. So the work was mainly done in February then. And as you said, inflation has turned out to be higher even immediately than we had forecast. And we see that especially in food prices and energy prices. I think all of us see that in gasoline prices. Some of that relates to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which we had the beginning of it, but the impact's been much more.
Yeah, Director, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, inflation was up 7.5%, correct?
Yes, inflation last year was up very sharply.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So given that inflation continues to hover around a 40-year high, not to mention that inflation has gone up 11% since President Biden came into office, if you were writing this baseline today, knowing what you know now, how would that affect your projections and assumptions?
Okay, no, very good. As I said, so inflation in the first couple months of the year has turned out to be higher than we anticipated. It looks like the current quarter that we're in is coming in around our projections. The Fed has raised interest rates by more, and of course that's had an impact on financial markets. So it's sort of a sum of each. That inflation has been higher than we anticipated. The Fed's hiking, probably as a result, has been higher. And of course, we've seen the impact of that on financial markets.
So do you expect that 4.7% to be much lower than where we actually end up for the year?
We don't redo our forecast just because the way we do our.
Okay, so you're saying the rest of the year we're going to be at 1% to match to be able to get the 4.7
to meet our forecast, which as you think, so, there is a risk there. Absolutely.
So we're clearly, I'll tell you right now, if you all think we're going to be at 1% the rest of the year, I got some oceanfront property in Arizona to sell you, Director. Let me ask you about your economic growth objections. Your budget says the economy will grow at 3.1% this year. But given that the most recent GDP report actually showed a decline of 1.4%, knowing what you know now, how would the current dismal economic numbers affect your projections? Or are you sticking with it like you are the inflation numbers?
Okay. Again, just because the process we have, that once we have the baseline, that's locked down. So we're not going to, we don't redo our forecast. As you said, the first quarter had negative GDP growth. Some of that we see unwinding with, changes in inventories and trade. The outlook for the year is based on people coming back into the labor force. There's about 1 million people still on the sidelines who we see as coming back, and that's supporting, in part, the rebound that we see in the economics over the course of this year.
So, let's ask this: your future year inflation projections are relatively mild compared to where we are actually currently at with inflation, 8.3% in the most recent year-to-year CPI report, and 11% since Biden took office. But taking your projections for inflation, which assumes back to more normalized levels of 2% in a few years, what is the long-term damage to the U.S. budget and economic outlook of even the so-called short burst in inflation if it is actually short-lived?
So inflation has a number of effects on the economy and of course on the fiscal outlook. The key risk is interest rates. That high inflation leads to high interest rates, both through what the Fed is doing and through market reactions. And then as the debt level has gone up, higher interest rates translate into higher net interest outlays. And you see that in our projection over 10 years, net interest outlays as a share of GDP are more than doubling in our projection. So that is the fiscal risk of high inflation. It comes through high interest rates and high payments to service the U.S. debt.
Director, I'm a little concerned with some of the proposals you selected in your alternative fiscal assumptions modeling. For starters, a lot of them seem targeted at tax relief Republicans. When they want to continue to provide, which now has a proven track record of economic growth and historic revenue generation. In your alternative assumptions, you do incorporate, say things that the majority has been very clear that they do not view as temporary pandemic policies, and they want to continue, say things like the cost of continuing the student loan repayment moratorium indefinitely, canceling student loan debt altogether, a permanent extension of the child tax credit revision included in the American Rescue Plan that failed to include work requirements, and let's say a continuation of the increased Affordable Care Act subsidies that are set to expire.
Oh, okay. So, no, thank you for the question. And I know that that this is extremely important to you, and we're continuing to work on some of these issues. Of course, we've done some work for you and for Senator Graham on these expiring provisions. We'll continue to do that. What we have in the report is Chapter 5 in the report is the alternative scenarios. Essentially, we followed the practice in the past of looking at provisions such as the tax ones that you mentioned that have been in place for several years and continue. And the challenge for us was so much of the pandemic-related provisions were in the law for maybe a year and then expire. The child tax credits, as you mentioned, the expanded subsidies for the Affordable Care Act. We did not, of course, we didn't extend them in the baseline since they're not in current law. And then for the alternative provisions, we did not extend those either. Again, because they're not in current law, they're not scheduled to expire in the future. It's analysis that we can do, of course, along with the JCT to answer the sorts of questions that I know you're very focused on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, you're on mute.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, you're still on mute.
Oh, I hit it. I'm sorry. Now you have 5 minutes. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I too associate myself with your remarks earlier about the American Rescue Plan. I just want to remind all of our colleagues that this pandemic has taken over 1 million lives. I shudder to think what would have happened had we not passed the American Rescue Plan. And it has saved lives and it's saved livelihoods. And so we can't forget that in terms of the investments that were made. Let me thank our director for being here. And let me just go right into our questions, because I think I'm going to ask about the Department of Defense. It's quite frankly the only cabinet agency not to pass an audit. And I have legislation that would require DOD to pass an audit or face automatic spending cuts. So how does DOD's failure to pass an audit complicate budget planning? From an auditing point of view, how much Pentagon spending is unaccounted for? Why should this Congress continue to add more and more money to the defense top line in the meantime, if it can't be audited, if there's no accountability? And what sort of forcing mechanism should we be considering in Congress to get DOD to pass an audit? And this has been supported by my bill, by my colleagues on the other side of the House. What can we do It's long overdue. And you also finally, the report, how DOD might save $1 trillion over the next 10 years. It concluded that we can better defend our country by getting more for less money. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I'd be glad to talk about this. And it's the problems you're pointing to are a challenge for us as well. That we aim for our baseline that we provided yesterday to inform policymakers, to inform you and your colleagues. And when the information that we get from the executive branch is, I guess imperfect is the nice way of putting it, that means our baseline isn't as informative as it should be. And so absolutely, we are there, and better information from DOD and from others would help us and help us serve the Congress with our mission. In terms of the defense budget going forward, of course, CBO doesn't provide policy recommendations, but we have done a number of studies that will help policymakers look at different choices for the defense. We recently put out a tool, it's actually online, on different force structures that your staff could go through and say, okay, if we change the services in different ways, what would be the fiscal implications of that? And of course, we're not saying do this or do that, but you can see that basically how much money is saved by different choices on the national security side.
Well, let me ask you though, it has failed to pass an audit. What do we do? If a business fails to pass an audit, it gets dinged. There are penalties. Agencies have penalties. People have penalties. Why does the Defense Department get away with unaccounted spending? It boggles my mind. There's no accountability there. So I know you can't suggest policies, but tell me how inappropriate it is for our budgeting process to go forward without a clear picture. I mean, we need to know what's, the hand needs to be shown in terms of what you're dealing with. Otherwise, it's not a good mechanism for us to make forecasts or for us to make decisions on our spending if we let agencies just run amok with the resources that we appropriate.
Right, and of course, most of the national security spending is appropriations. And so we support the appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate as they take up the FY23 appropriations. And you're absolutely right that imperfect information means that we're not able to support them in the way that we need to.
So how do you audit? Okay, so what do you do? What would your suggestions be on any agency that is not auditable?
No, it's a difficult question for us because we provide information to the budget committees to enforce the budget rules, and it's really more GAO that does the auditing, and of course has very substantial expertise in auditing. So really, they're the one, and they would put forward policy recommendations. So they're the ones who would, go out and say, here's how the situation can be improved.
Well, with your new, CBO baseline, it's a real shame and disgrace that you all aren't working together, and you're not suggesting it impairs your ability to be accurate in forecasting if they don't insist on an audit. But in terms of the baseline dealing with inflation, how does the Pentagon's budget assumptions fit in to that in terms of CBO's baseline?
Okay. No, absolutely. And essentially it goes both ways, that the fiscal spending has an impact on inflation. And of course, the decline in spending from last year to this year will alleviate some of the inflationary pressures going forward. But of course, it's in the other direction as well, that inflation affects military spending. The military is, as I understand it, the largest purchaser of jet fuel, for example. So energy costs will affect them as well. So it definitely, there's an impact on inflation, between inflation and national security spending, that goes in both directions.
Gentlewoman's time has expired, and now you have 5 minutes. From California, Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find it astonishing that the chairman would tout the so-called American Rescue Plan as a success. Even Democratic consultants like Steve Ratner and Larry Summers were warning that it was so irresponsible that it would trigger a crippling inflation. Mr. Chairman, it turns out all the free checks you sent out were actually very expensive. and Americans are paying them back every day at the grocery store, the gas station, the tax collector, everywhere they spend money. I've seen a report costing average families about $5,000 from their purchasing power. My God, but before the lockdowns took a wrecking ball to the economy, we had the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, the lowest poverty rate in 60 years, the fastest wage growth in 40 years, and it was working class families gaining the most. The gap between rich and poor was actually narrowing for the first time in our lifetimes. We were energy independent for the first time in our lifetimes. Inflation was around 1%. Interest rates were near all-time lows. That didn't happen by accident. The Republican tax cuts produced one of the biggest economic expansions in history, an expansion that was so great, we ended up taking in more revenues after the tax cuts than we'd received before them. We saw the biggest regulatory rollback in history that freed up American energy resources, brought companies back to America from overseas. But all you had to do was continue those policies that produced this prosperity. And instead you did the opposite. You spent trillions of dollars we didn't have. You started what Mr. Biden just called an incredible transition away from fossil fuels by imposing the highest gasoline prices in American history. You've admitted into our country an impoverished population the size of West Virginia that American taxpayers have to now support. And you have the audacity to try to tell us that the economy's doing great. Just a word of advice, you can't spin the economy. Every person knows how the economy is doing because they're living it every day. And that's what makes the old Reagan question so devastating to you and your party. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Everybody knows the answer to that in their own lives. And they can see clearly who's responsible for it. You're not fooling anyone. Now, Mr. Swagel, I want to begin with three numbers that describe the fiscal reality we face: 28, 76, and 89. According to our calculations, 28% is the growth in population and inflation combined over the last 10 years. 28%. 76% is the growth in revenues, which means that revenues are growing at nearly 3 times the rate of inflation and population over the past 10 years. That's after the tax cuts. 89% is the increase in spending, and spending is the fine point of the matter. Seems to me there are only 3 ways to pay for it. Taxes, but personal taxes decrease the purchasing power of families in the present. Business taxes are passed through to consumers as higher prices, to employees as lower wages, and to investors as lower earnings. So that's one way you can do it. Second way is to borrow from capital markets, but of course this reduces the capital available to finance construction and consumer spending and home and automobile purchases and business expansion. And of course, borrowing is paid back through future taxes, and it generates additional interest costs along the way. And the third way is to borrow from ourselves, essentially printing money, which is the direct cause of inflation. Too many dollars chasing too few goods. So it follows then that it's excessive spending that is driving all 3 drags on the economy. To paraphrase the Clinton era maxim, it's the spending stupid. Mr. Swagel, am I missing anything?
No. I mean, I think you've got it. That right. The inflation we're seeing is the combination of very strong demand and much of that is driven by by fiscal policy. Certainly, there's a recovery from the pandemic combined with the supply constraints, and those are driving inflation.
Well, let's talk about that inflation rate for a second. 8.3%, as I understand it. So does that mean if I managed to put away $100,000 in my retirement fund, does that mean I've just lost $8,300 in purchasing power over the last year?
Or that would be one implication that the number you gave is the most recent 12 months of inflation. It means that Americans nominal wages are up, but real wages are down for most Americans. So it's a challenge for families and a challenge for the economy, absolutely, and a fiscal challenge as well.
And isn't the classic definition of inflation too many dollars chasing too few goods? So if you flood the economy with dollars while you raise taxes on productivity, you get more inflation or less inflation?
Right. I mean, we have very strong demand and serious constraints on supply, and those dollars chasing the inadequate supply that leads to higher inflation.
Great. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu.
Dr. Swagel, thank you for being here with us today. As a member of the Ways and Means Committee, I've made it my mission for years to lower the cost of prescription drugs. It's unconscionable that Americans pay the highest prices in the world for the exact same drugs. People with diabetes have to pay triple the cost for insulin compared with those living in countries like Canada. And now 1 in 5 seniors struggle to afford their medications. That's why it was so significant that when the House passed the budget reconciliation bill, it included provisions to lower prescription drug costs by allowing Medicare to negotiate prices for certain high-cost drugs. And it also penalized drug makers for hiking prices faster than inflation. It lowered out-of-pocket expenses for seniors and capped the price of insulin at $35 for those covered by Medicare and private insurance. While the CBO estimated that these provisions would result in nearly $80 billion of savings in Medicare and would reduce the federal deficit by nearly $300 billion. So, Mr. Swagel, can you explain how these provisions would not only reduce federal spending, but also lower prescription drugs for Americans?
Oh, yes, of course. And this is first from our cost estimate for HR 3, and then, as you said, inside the Build Back Better Act. The provisions in Build Back Better and HR 3 would set up a system of negotiation between the Secretary of HHS and drug companies. The Secretary would have very substantial leverage in the form of an excise tax. We've done substantial modeling for that. We've put out working papers that explain the technical details. We find that would lower drug prices. The lower drug prices would have many effects. Some of them would be health. People would take more medicine and have healthier impacts that would save money on doctors and hospitals. The lower drug prices would save money for the federal government because the cost of health insurance would be lower, and the federal government subsidizes health insurance through a variety of ways: employers, the ACA, Medicaid, and others. So the system in that bill, by lowering drug prices, would both make people healthier and save money for the federal government.
Thank you. And now I'd like to ask about paid family leave. As you know, the U.S. is the only country among 41 nations that does not mandate any paid leave for new parents, according to data compiled by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Democrats in the House tried to rectify that by passing a national paid family and medical leave program. Your analysis of that proposal found some important things. First, having access to paid family and medical leave could improve physical and mental health for some workers. Second, while some employers might reduce their company paid leave policies and shift to the federal program, that's not a bad thing for workers. Employees would still get paid leave, and you found that employers would increase pay or provide other benefits to attract good workers. Could you expand on how a federal paid family leave program might help increase pay for workers?
No, that's right. So we've done a lot of work on this, including a set of slides in 2021 that went through the various dimensions in which paid leave would affect workers and affect the fiscal situation. And as you said, that might lead some people to come back into the labor market, people for whom who are taking care of family members or loved ones, parents, and the availability of paid leave would make it possible to come back into the labor market. For people already working, it would give them added flexibility. It might change the way they're compensated. So there'd be lots of different economic effects. We had that in the cost estimate for Build Back Better, for the Build Back Better Act, as passed by the House of Representatives. We had that as costing the federal government $200 billion over 10 years. That's from 2022 to 2031. So there'd be a fiscal cost, and as you said, there'd be implications for families and for the economy.
And just quickly, one of the drivers of increasing deficits and debt over the decade is the aging of the population. How would immigration reform help keep our promises to our seniors?
So as you said, as the decade goes on, as we get out into the long-term outlook, the aging of the population becomes an important driver the fiscal challenge, both through Social Security and through Medicare. Immigrants make substantial contributions to the U.S. economy. The immigrants who are here and new immigrants. If people of working age come in, they would tend to pay into the trust fund supporting Social Security and Medicare. They get benefits. Those would be off into the future. Of course, they boost growth, they boost innovation, they boost our society in other ways. So of course, it's up to policymakers. CBO doesn't put forward policy recommendations, but increased immigration has many effects on the economy and on the fiscal trajectory.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired, and now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Thank you much. I was trying to scramble here and find a Ronald Reagan quote. I couldn't find it in time, so I'm going to have to kind of guess a little bit. Our forefathers didn't come here to copy Europe. And I always run into people, who came here from England, came here from Germany, came here from a variety of European nations. I'm sure occasionally somebody goes the other way, but largely everybody wants to come here. And I would suggest that's in part because we have less government, and government does less in America than it does in Europe. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the overall level of spending and the effect of two bills, the American Rescue Plan, which I thought was about the most fiscally reckless thing I've ever seen, and the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I think we already saw that. I would even argue the CARES Act was somewhat excessive. I know what happened under President Trump. I know it was negotiated by Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, who was a Democrat, kind of looked like it. But in any event, I'd like to ask you, in your 10-year deficit projections, how much has the legislation enacted so far by this Congress affected them, including the American Rescue Plan and the bipartisan infrastructure framework?
Oh, okay. No, absolutely. And as I said, I'm holding up the report. It's on page 30 of our report. Figure 2-2 goes through and shows the impact of the major legislation. And so you can see that the early pandemic legislation, especially the CARES Act, was essentially contributed over $2 trillion to the deficit last year, and another roughly $500 billion this year, and so on. You can see in there the American Rescue Plan Act also was over $1 trillion in 2021, and then about $400 billion this year. Now, since February 21, overall, the legislation that's been enacted has increased spending by $3.4 trillion, and of that, $2.4 trillion was since our July 2021 update. So it's $3.4 trillion in legislation since February 2021.
Already.
That's right. And that's under current law. Of course, that would not include Build Back Better, since that is not part of current law. Okay.
Now, I'll give you another question. There have been a lot of actions of the Biden administration, and quite frankly, I think the high unemployment, which began in the CARES Act, was to a certain extent extended by President Biden. I think that encourages people not to work. You made the assumption in your presentation today that unemployment is going down because the pandemic is ending and less people are sick or whatever. Do you think part of the reason unemployment is going down is we're going to peel off those excessively high unemployment benefits? Could that be one of the reasons why more people are getting back to work? We no longer bribe people quite as much not to work.
That is certainly part of it. And one of the things that we see today, as compared to our economic projections a year ago, is that there's about just over 1 million, it's like 1.1 million people who are still out of the labor market, who we thought a year ago would be back.
What do you attribute that to? Generous government benefits, or what?
It's a mix. In part, we think it's the effects of unemployment insurance and the other transfers last year had some impact. It's also health concerns, it's childcare. I think we all understand that the federal government hasn't given clear guidance to childcare providers. I mean, it affects me, the 276 people I work with here. They're our childcare providers. It's just a welter of.
I want to give you another question along that vein. Since January 2021, the Biden administration has spent hundreds of billions of dollars without congressional approval through various executive actions. And a lot of these programs are programs in which we pay people not to work. It includes the higher SNAP benefits, about $250 billion, student loan repayment moratoriums, dropping previous actions related to strengthening work requirements and welfare programs, which I think, is clearly you don't want people to work. You want them to depend on the government. Total cost of Biden administration's executive actions could be $500 billion or more. CBO's budget outlook provides information on how much the deficit has increased due to the laws passed by Congress. Do you think you should also include how much it's increased due to the impact of executive actions?
No, and we try to provide as much information as we can. And some of this is in the baseline. For example, you mentioned the thrifty food plan update that increased SNAP benefits. So that's in the baseline. It turned out it's roughly $225 billion over the 10 from 2022 to 2032. There's other executive actions that we can't quantify. There's the EO 13990 relating to the climate change. We just we can't pinpoint where that enters into the budget. There's just not enough specificity for us to say what's the impact on the budget. So when we can, we certainly try to provide that information. And sometimes, it's just a little bit too amorphous for us to pinpoint.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the extra time, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry. That was Dr. Swagle's answer. And now gentleman's time has expired. And now you have 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from the U.S. Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett.
Hi, good morning. I'm sorry, was having some technical difficulties there. Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, and to the ranking member for holding today's hearing on the Congressional Budget Office's Budget and Economic Outlook. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to Director Swagel for appearing before us today and providing insight into the year's budget and economic outlook. I believe CBO is invaluable to our work here in Congress, and the release of this report will help us begin the conversation on addressing fiscal issues. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Climate Prediction Center recently announced that they are predicting an above normal Atlantic hurricane season. The Virgin Islands specifically is still recovering from Hurricane Irma and Maria. Could you tell me how our climate-related disasters and storms expected to affect the federal budget and economic outlook?
Yes, Representative Plaskett. So it's something that we have done a lot of work on, and that is embedded in the economic baseline that we produced yesterday. So we look at the effects of climate over time, affecting the economy and affecting the fiscal situation, both through the effects on things like agriculture and construction, and then through disasters, through wildfires, which is very important right now, and hurricanes. And those both have a measurable impact that reduce GDP and therefore reduce revenues over the forecast, and that is in our baseline.
Great, thank you for that. We hear a lot of discussion surrounding inflation, and it is, of course, something that Congress cannot ignore, although we recognize that this is a global issue that's occurring. Prices for groceries, housing, gas, and other forms of energy are steadily rising. You saw the House recently passed a bill with no Republican support to lower gas prices by cracking down on alleged price gouging by energy companies. The House and Senate both passed versions of a bipartisan U.S. competitiveness bill that will strengthen supply chains and lower costs for American consumers. What additional acts can Congress take to mitigate the effects of inflation? We cannot just complain about it, we have to do something about it. I know that my side of the aisle is working steadily to do that and are trying to work in a bipartisan. What are some of the suggestions you have for us to do that?
Okay, no, and I should just preface what I'll say is that CBO, we provide analysis and not policy recommendations. So I will give you some examples of supply constraints that are affecting inflation, and just please, be aware that this is not my saying you should do this. I'm answering the question.
I love your disclaimer. Very smart. Okay. Thank you.
it's really the key to this organization is set by Alice Rivlin from the beginning, that we don't provide, we don't tell members what they should do. There's supply constraints and affecting the economy and labor markets and product markets in international, right? So one is tariffs, and we have a write-up of that in the report, that tariffs are raising the price of many products, anything with steel, anything with aluminum. And we have a tariff on infant formula. The CBP until recently was, and so this, I guess bragging is the right word, of keeping out infant formula. And obviously that's changed, but that's the sort of impediment of trade policy. So that's one. We talked about immigration before. I mentioned childcare. I think, again, I'm speaking a little bit on behalf of CBO employees. Getting clear guidance on childcare and the pandemic and the virus would be helpful. And then energy. You mentioned energy. There's energy transportation. The Jones Act instances raises costs for transporting goods and services, and energy is part of that. And there's other provisions that could be taken. So again, CBO wouldn't say what to do, but there's anything on the supply side would help reduce inflation.
So thank you very much for that answer. And with so little time, I just want to yield back and thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And thank you so much to the witness for answering the questions and being a policy advisor on letting us know what policy affects those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlewoman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. I want to concur with the comments of Mr. McClintock earlier. I found the comments by the chairman, with all due respect, and by Mr. Jeffries to be astounding when they talked about the health of this economy. And I can tell you that is not what my constituents are experiencing. They're experiencing massive price increases at the pump. They're making tough decisions about whether they can buy gas or go buy food. They're deferring retirement. It goes on and on. And so I don't know that I've ever felt the comments that were so out of touch with what my constituents are feeling. And frankly, it's why Democrats are in big trouble in the upcoming midterm elections, because of that out of touchness that we're hearing today. The other thing I want to say, Mr. Swagel, the argument that you sort of concurred with in regards to Ukraine causing the inflation, but then in the next sentence, you admitted that inflation was 7.2% or something like that before Ukraine started. So how can you tell us how you can reconcile those two statements?
Yeah, no, okay, no, it's an important question. And so inflation was high before the invasion of Ukraine.
So
and
it was not caused by Ukraine.
No, inflation was high, especially elevated in the U.S. The Ukraine shock was a global shock, because now we've seen inflation around the world go up.
But inflation here was not caused by Ukraine. Would you concur with that?
Oh, absolutely. Inflation was high in the U.S. before Ukraine. It's gotten higher because of the effects of the invasion of Ukraine.
Yes. Then one other thing you said. You talked about sort of the classic economic formula, and I'm not an economist, but you increase demand, you decrease supply, you're going to have inflation. That's what happened here. What are you talking about when you say increased demand?
Increased demand, we think of that as spending by families, by households, by businesses,
it's
by
the
the government.
trillions of dollars that was inserted into the economy by Democrat spending that increased demand and caused inflation, correct?
That would be certainly a contribution to it. Was the fiscal inflationary impact of fiscal policy.
The biggest part of it, right?
It's a little bit. There's both, because you had
the American Rescue Plan caused the inflation that we're seeing now.
I would say it definitely contributed to it. The fiscal policy, the economy was really.
Most economists that I talk to believe that it was the primary factor in causing inflation that we're seeing. Are you disagreeing with that?
No, I'm not disagreeing. I'm just going to say that.
Okay, thank you.
There's two.
I appreciate it. I'm sorry. I'm going to keep going.
No, of course.
Because I think it's really important that we come to an understanding about what has caused some of these disastrous economic situations that we're in for our constituents. So I appreciate you answering those questions. The Democrats talk about reducing deficits in this budget, in their budget, which is pretty bizarre when you look at the numbers. I want to see if you agree with me on this as well. They're estimating a $1.6 trillion in average federal deficits over the next decade. Is that right?
That's right. That's the 10-year average.
Do you know what the average was in the 10 years prior to COVID? Like we all know it was an anomaly during COVID. What was the average in the 10 years prior to COVID?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have it offhand. It was
$829 billion average.
Okay.
So in the 10 years prior, not even looking at any numbers going up and down, they're doubling in the 10 years coming up compared to the 10 years prior to COVID. The year before COVID, the deficit was $984 trillion. So how could the Democrats possibly credibly be saying that they're reducing deficits in any way?
Right. I mean, the deficit is coming down this year as the emergency spending of the
But
pandemic.
it's only because we spent trillions and it's because they spent trillions and trillions of dollars or more, and now they claim that they're reducing deficit. It makes absolutely no sense, and I think everyone can easily see that. How concerned are you with our debt to GDP? If you give us a little bit of history on where we are in debt to our gross domestic product.
Right. So the debt to GDP ratio is just under 100% this year.
How does that compare to historical average?
It's essentially, right up there near where we were at the peak when we were paying for World War II.
And currently it's projected to keep increasing. Are you concerned about that?
That's right. I am concerned that the debt ratio by the end of the 10-year window goes up to 120% higher than ever, and the service cost more than doubles. So goes up to 3.3% of GDP just to do the annual servicing. And that's with interest rates are still pretty moderate by historical standards.
That's why this budget is so irresponsible, and I thank you for pointing that out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for holding this hearing. And Dr. Swagel, thanks for being here. Let's start with the good in this report. Despite the havoc the pandemic wreaked on our economy, the economy is fairly strong if you look at higher wages and lower unemployment rates. In San Diego, our unemployment rate sits at just 3.5%. Your testimony notes that the size of the labor force, which in early 2022 remained 1 million people below its pre-pandemic level, is expected to keep increasing, exceeding that level by the end of 2022. And what is driving the recovery in the labor force participation rate?
So it's a mix. It's got to be a large part of that is the reopening of the economy and scientific progress. Progress with the virus. There's probably the strong, the tight labor market and rising wages are leading people to come back in. It could be high inflation. In some senses, is pushing people who need more income to come back in as well.
And I suppose over time that will serve to address some of the supply issues in the labor market that are driving inflation. Don't you agree with that?
That's right, and that's essentially why we have inflation moderating over the next couple of years.
Well, let's turn to some of the bad things in the report. You estimate inflation will remain elevated through 2022, and the Federal Reserve will hike interest rates to fight inflation. And I commend the Fed for doing that. But at the same time, we have to confront the consequences of rising rates. I'm serving currently as the vice chair of policy for the New Democratic Coalition, and I helped start an inflation working group to identify solutions to ease inflation and ease the effects of inflation on families. I want to just note, you've mentioned immigration, you've mentioned tariffs. I also note that my colleagues on the other aisle, when they had the control of all three branches, lowered taxes for wealthy people in the middle of a booming economy. I'm happy to work with any of my colleagues on anything they want to do on any of those things, to get a fairer tax system, to cut back on the Trump tariffs, and to deal with immigration, which they've really left the building on. And I hear a lot of criticism, but I don't hear from the other side of the aisle is answers on what they'd like to do about this. Dr. Swagel, based on the Fed's current trajectory, do you predict inflation will slow in 2023 and 24? but spending on interest payments will grow each year for the next decade. Can you describe in a little bit more detail how interest payments will rise substantially over the next 10 years and how that compares to previous outlooks as a share of our total budget?
I can. So interest payments rise both with higher interest rates and with the increased debt. And the challenge is that the debt level has gone up by so much that even a pretty modest increase in interest rates will have an outsized effect. Now, it's not immediate because we're not funding the U.S. debt with like 30-day T-bills. So there's some time period over which those debt payments go up. We're at 1.6% of GDP for net interest outlays today. The 50-year average is like 2%. So we're actually below the 50-year average just because interest rates still remain moderate. And that's the challenge, that we're going up. We're going up to like 3.6% by the end of the 10-year window, both because the debt is going up, but also because interest rates are going up. And interest rates in our projection go up kind of moderately. So that's, in instances if interest rates go up even more, then the net interest payments, the challenge there would get even sharper.
I have a personal concern as a policy matter about continuing to spend more on interest than on the future of our children. Are there budget consequences for doing that?
Oh, absolutely. And the choice that you highlighted, that is the choice, right? And we are going to pay the interest payments on our debt, right? And that's since Alexander Hamilton. That's part of the country. But that crowds out other priorities, or it means that policymakers must put in place more revenue provisions. So it's rising interest rates and rising debt payments pose a challenge and a choice for policymakers.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate very much this hearing. I would just say to my colleagues on the other aisle, they all know that I'm interested in the deficit and working with them on the deficit. I'd invite them to work with us on immigration, on the Trump tariffs, and on a tax system that funds this government in a way that's good for our fiscal health as well as for our children. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Swagel, for being here. I want to build off what some of my colleagues have been talking about the deficit. Here we have the 2021 deficit, the second highest in American history, was $517 billion over CBO's estimate. Yet the Biden administration is trying to tout this as a deficit reduction. I mean, honestly and sincerely and seriously, do you think we're stupid?
I don't think I should answer that question.
Okay, well, don't answer it then, but we're not. I will tell you, it's just ridiculous. Here we have the $2.78 trillion deficit, that it's almost 3 times the average $1 trillion 10-year average deficit. And yet they're saying it's a deficit reduction. It just baffles me that someone could possibly even think that or say that. But let me ask you this: what was the largest contributor to the deficit growth between last year's projection and this year's?
So there was some new legislation that was enacted. It was both the Investment Infrastructure and Jobs Act, and then the FY22 appropriations that were passed earlier this year. And so that was new spending. Some of that shows up this year, and that was offset by increased revenues, and then of course the pandemic-related spending that fell away. So that's why the deficit falls from is 2.8 trillion last year to 1 trillion this year. The combination of essentially the pandemic spending falling away and then some increased revenues.
Okay, well, let me ask you this: has the administration or the democratically controlled Congress, either one of them, have they taken any steps to stabilize our debt or to deal with the dramatic disparity that we are witnessing right now between our growing spending and the revenues that fail to cover that spending?
The fiscal trajectory is challenging, and so that that is essentially, I think, the message of the report we released yesterday. That choices need to be made. It's not not that this year there's going to be a crisis, maybe not even by the end of the 10 years, but the trajectory is challenging and will drive the need for choices to be made.
We all know that inflation has gone up every month since this president has been in office. I guess you could make the argument maybe it ticked down a couple of points or a couple of tenths of a point last month. It went from 8.5 to 8.3, but I can assure you, you're going to see it go back up again this month. But every month, when Joe Biden went in office, when this president went in office, the inflation rate was 1.7%. Now here we are at 8.3, 8.5%. What, you know, we don't have a revenue problem. What we got is a spending problem. But let me ask you this. How much do you think we need to reduce the deficit to stall inflation?
So of course, some of that is in the works with the reduction in, the falling off of pandemic related spending, and the amount instances of contractionary, impulse that's needed to reduce inflation. It's going to depend on the success of the Fed's efforts and also on the supply constraints falling away. So it's not clear. I can't give you a single number of what needs to be done on the fiscal side because it depends on the Fed and on what happens with the supply side.
Let me ask you something. Inflation was at 7% in 2021, and it was at 8.3% over the last 12 months, and it's running at an 11% pace so far this year. The last time we experienced this kind of inflation, the effective interest rate on the debt was 10.8%. How does that limit our ability to reduce our debt?
No, it's an important challenge that as interest rates go up, given the increase in the debt level, that means that net interest outlays will rise as a share of the budget and a share of the economy. And that is going to crowd out other things or require action to raise revenues. And so we have a pretty moderate increase in interest rates, and that already has a pretty substantial rise in spending to service the debt.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but we had a 0.5% increase in the interest rate by the Federal Reserve, which resulted in $29 billion interest, an increase of $29 billion interest, just like that.
Right.
And don't think that the interest rate isn't going to go up again. It's probably going to go up 2 or 3 more times at that rate. And how much is that going to cost us?
Right. And we have.
I'm sorry, I'm out of time, but what's it going to take? What's it going to take to get people's attention at what's going on here?
Is that a rhetorical question, gentlemen?
No, it's a real question, and maybe you can follow up in writing for me. Tell me what it's going to take, because I really need to know. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence, and I yield back.
That's right. Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know it's tempting to get into the usual partisan food fight and score points. I'm going to use my precious 5 minutes that I had with someone as esteemed as you for perhaps a better purpose. And I'm struck, Mr. Swagel, that whenever I'm with colleagues of mine, fellow parliamentarians from around the world, especially in Europe, obviously right now the Russian invasion and attack on Ukraine is paramount. But a close second to that is every one of my colleagues is speaking about the inflation going on in their country. It is pretty much a worldwide issue, so hardly something we're dealing with in the U.S. So I was wondering if you could take a step back and maybe just give us the lay of the land internationally and especially in other Western democracies at what inflation looks like for those countries.
Okay, no, very good. And I can speak to that. And that affects the U.S. because the condition of foreign countries affects us, both China, the lockdowns there, and what it does to our supply side, and then demand in other countries for U.S. exports. Right. So other countries are suffering from some of the same factors as we are. And I talked about earlier the Ukraine-related shock on food and energy, and of course Europe is much more affected by the negative effects of the energy shock there. So inflation has risen for all countries. For the U.S., the U.S. is first. So it does look like we had something different last year. The combination of the supply issues in the U.S. and the demand in the U.S., it made us go first. And so, that that is a factor. And more recently, all countries are facing similar challenges together.
Yeah, my Belgian colleagues tell me theirs is over 8%. A French parliamentarian who I'm friends with, I think, pegged it at 7.5%. So obviously this is a challenge worldwide. Do you think one of the lessons coming out of COVID is, well, you'll see this is a bit of a leading question, but something I've been pushing for a number of years now is to increase domestic manufacturing, both for economic reasons, but also in terms of our national security. Do you believe now that coming out of the COVID experience, the argument for that is strengthened? And maybe you could even talk about some other critical parts of our supply chain that we now realize are really at risk, and COVID helped expose that.
Right. I can talk about a couple of dimensions, and of course, there's many dimensions to this. It's almost the closer you get to it, the more dimensions there are. It's fractal, I think is the word for that. And so we've seen the supply chain issues that have bedeviled the U.S. economy even from the very beginning of the pandemic. And of course, items produced in the U.S., those supply chains have been more resilient. But even there, the labor, issues with the labor supply have affected the U.S. I think we all understand now the impact of some of the critical supply chains, like in medicine and other critical issues, relying on foreign countries is difficult. And of course, not every foreign country is the same. So there is an important discussion to be had there about our trade alliances. And then lastly, obviously, what's happening with infant formula, right? There's ample supply, global supplies of safe and nutritious formula. It's the U.S. that, in some sense, we have inflicted the problem on ourselves. And so it's just a different wrinkle on the supply chain. And so absolutely, it's coming out of the pandemic. I think we all understand we need to focus on this more. It has an economic impact, a fiscal impact, and of course, an impact on families.
Yeah. One thing in speaking to a pretty prominent economist, Ian Stevenson, he believes that inflation is going to be a challenge for the rest of the year, beginning to come down next spring. And once it dropping pretty precipitously. You talked about this way back in the beginning, but I was wondering if you could just kind of offer your thoughts on that timetable, where you agree, disagree.
Yeah, so we have the supply issues facing the country generally waning over the course of this year. I talked, I think, earlier about the labor supply. That's one. We see some of the trade supply issues. The situation at some of the key U.S. ports looks to be getting better. The China lockdowns don't yet seem to be affecting their exports too much. So that is supporting our expectation that inflationary pressures will diminish over the course of the year. And then, of course, as we've discussed a couple of times, the demand side pressures driving inflation will diminish as well, both from what the Fed is doing and from fiscal policy, the pandemic spending falling away.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Director Swagel for being here today as well. Despite the last update of inflation being 8.3%, CBO's new economic baseline projects a rate of only 5.1% in this quarter. I think everyone would prefer if inflation really were only 5.1%. Obviously, however, CBO is underestimating the level of inflation. We all know that the assessment of our fiscal future is sensitive to inflation. You have inflation going down over the next year quite a bit. Can you talk about if inflation does stay at the rates that we're seeing now, the impact that would have on families, particularly those who are working on fixed incomes?
Absolutely. It's the inflation we've seen already poses an important challenge for families. It means that family incomes just don't go as far. And so even though wages are up, nominal wages are up, prices are up by more. And so most Americans over the past year have seen their real, their real take-home pay go down. And if that continues, as you say, that would continue to pose an important challenge for families.
Now, we're expecting federal deficits to exceed $2 trillion by 2031 and 2032, going on in perpetuity. The president's budget does nothing to address these deficits going forward does nothing to move us towards fiscal responsibility or balance in any way. And this represents a huge crowding out of private investment and economic growth. How would you say that these recurring deficits are going to impact the fiscal futures for American families as well?
Oh, it's through the mechanism that you highlight is an important one. That the deficit over time, as it gets larger, crowds out private spending, private investment, and that leads to higher interest rates than otherwise. That affects American businesses, American families. It affects job creation. It affects productivity. Again, this is in our forecast. This is not a crisis. We don't have a recession in our forecast, but it's more like a slow undermining of the the foundation of success for the American economy.
And CBO is also expecting the Fed to reduce its holdings of federal debt by roughly $2 trillion over the next 3 years. This would also contribute to that crowding out of private investment. The last time the Fed promised to reduce its holding of federal debt, it only offloaded about $750 billion, leaving its assets 300% larger than before the 2008 financial crisis. Do you really think that the Fed will reduce its assets by this much and stop facilitating massive federal deficits?
So in our economic forecast, we have the Fed, as you said, reducing its asset holdings. Essentially, it's going from quantitative easing to quantitative tightening, and that is pushing up long-term interest rates. And that's by design. The Fed is trying to reduce demand in the economy to reduce inflationary pressures. But that has an impact. It has an impact on families and on businesses. And, of course, the challenge for the Fed is getting that right and, reducing inflation without, excessive negative effects on families and businesses.
The government is repositioning and implementing more of this pseudo-socialist ideology that the current administration and the current congressional leadership is promoting. Government right now spends $4 on wealth redistribution for every dollar that it spends on government services. This uptick represents, as I said, a decades-long shift of the government moving closer to this pseudo-socialist dystopia of the left. Does the CBO have a position on this trend and the increasing use of government to redistribute wealth as opposed to support economic growth?
Okay. I would say that the transfers that you're pointing to are part of the fiscal challenge. That as we go out further, right, we have debt to GDP going to 110% by the end of the 10-year window to 185% out in 30 years, and that is driven overwhelmingly by mandatory spending, by Social Security and Medicare. And of course, CBO doesn't have a position on what the right spending is, how much or for what, but it's just the budget arithmetic that the fiscal challenge is being driven by mandatory spending.
And does the budget do anything to address this increase in mandatory spending?
No, our projection is current law. So current law has this very challenging fiscal trajectory.
And that's the greatest tragedy of this administration. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time is expiring now. Recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmuth and Ranking Member Smith. And I want to thank Director Swagel for being here. My question is, on pages 31 and 32 of your analysis, you mentioned that the expiration of the temporary provisions of the 2017 Tax Act, including the expiration of most of the provisions affecting individual income taxes at the end of 2025 and the phase out of bonus depreciation by the end of 2026, is projected to temporarily slow down the economic growth. That is a real concern to me. Looking at the economic growth rates you project after 2025, do your projections consider the damage to the economic growth and opportunity that would accompany an increase in the federal tax burden from the expiration of these tax and job cuts? Could you answer that?
Oh, yes, we do. So we have in 2018, CBO's analysis showed the impact of the 2017 Tax Act in boosting economic growth, boosting business investment and growth, and concomitantly the expiration of the individual side provisions. We have that as reducing growth, that economic growth and job creation. That's in our baseline.
Okay, so that is very significant. I mean, if those go away, if those tax cuts go away, I mean, this could be pretty significant reduction in economic growth. Is that fair to say?
That there is a slowdown. Now, in our baseline, we assume that the Fed would react to it and cut interest rates. So that's why the baseline has some sort of a modest slowdown. That's because we're anticipating that the Fed would react to it. That the Fed would see it coming and react to it in part.
Right,
but there'd be an economic impact.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
thank you. I'm glad you said that. There would be truly an economic impact. I want to transition over to the forecast that you state on our trust funds, and they're set to expire in the next several years. We got some real problems, and I understand the CBO is required by law to assume that the trust funds will make full payments after they expire. However, on page 127 of your report, it notes all active trust funds, including Social Security, Medicare Part A, and highway trust funds, are projected to ultimately increase the debt by $14 trillion over the next 10 years. Director Swagel, can you explain to the committee the seriousness of not mitigating the spending costs of these programs and the catastrophic effects that could exist if we don't start looking at these programs and how to fund them as we move forward?
No, absolutely. And in some sense, the trust funds represent the fiscal challenge not being over the horizon, but really right in front of us. And the trust funds, in some sense, are accounting devices that to redeem the special purpose bonds in the trust funds, the Treasury has to raise revenue just in the same way it does to fund any other spending. And so that table is table B2 on page 127, as you mentioned, that shows the deficit impacts of the trust funds over the next 10 years. And it's nearly $13.8 trillion, nearly $14 trillion.
Yeah, this to me is so serious. And unfortunately, the administration and the majority party are not even taking a look at this. And it's something that we just got to get our arms around. One other thing, it was stated yesterday that the U.S. economy contracted 1.5% on its annualized basis in the first quarter of this year. The downgrade revision of the GDP to me is very concerning. And it was noted that the contraction was partially attributed to the U.S. spending more on imports, with us reducing U.S. exports or on domestic goods. The administration has clearly showed that trade is not a priority. It has not filled a lot of the trade positions and in essence has not effectively completed any unilateral or bilateral trade deals. Can you explain how critical trade is to our economic growth as we move forward?
Absolutely. And trade is a critical part of our economy. As you said, it was an important factor in what happened in the first quarter. We see some of that unwinding over the rest of the year. We expect a bit better growth in other countries that should boost our exports. But over time, I mean, trade is a critical factor in the U.S. in supporting growth, in leading to lower inflation, and also boosting productivity. Right, larger markets mean through trade help American firms, and whereas a greater variety for American households, boosts their choice and lowers their prices. And that is trade.
Yeah, and I appreciate, Director, what you're saying. I mean, trade is so critical, and it just, again, doesn't seem like this administration has a handle on it, doesn't care about it, doesn't fill positions, is not doing any bilateral, unilateral trade deals. I'm just so disappointed there. So thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony, Director Swagel. Thanks for your appearance today. I find it interesting, if not surprising, that not many of our members in the majority want to participate today and defend the disastrous economic record of this administration, let alone its proposed budget, which would obviously exacerbate the problems we have. It's interesting. The only calls for bipartisanship I've heard from Democrats in my first term is during this hearing, because they don't want to hear from Republicans on the disaster that they've created economically. Director Swagel, if Democrats were trying to ruin the economy, if they were trying to do that, what would they have done differently on spending, on energy, paying people not to work, growing the welfare state, firing people for not getting vaccines, closing or making it hard for businesses to operate, suspending rent and student loan payments, and continuing other COVID mandates and so forth? What might you do differently if you were trying to ruin the economy over the past year and a half?
In our baseline, you can see the effect of the supply challenges that are facing the economy, and with the labor force participation, people not coming back. In part, that's because of the health reasons. And so anything that would get people to come back into the labor force, that would support greater supply and a stronger economy with lower inflation.
Yeah, I just can't imagine you would do anything differently if you were trying to ruin the economy than what they've done this past year and a half. Do you think that Americans can afford the president's continued pursuit of his Build Back Bankrupt plan? Or maybe said differently, how much worse off would we be if they were successful in passing the unprecedented $5 trillion worth of spending last fall?
Of course, CBO won't evaluate the merits or demerits of policy. We won't tell members what to do. The deficit reduction we've seen this year is under current law. And so if there's additional spending, that would go in the other direction of deficit reduction. And that could have implications for inflation as well. That, I think it's been widely understood that, the lower deficit means some fiscal constraint, and that is reducing inflation along with the actions of the Fed. And so additional spending would go in the other direction. And of course, the details would matter, but broadly speaking, that would have an effect on inflation as well.
Thanks for bringing up the debts. I know others have talked about that already today, but the administration's claiming a deficit reduction, as you know, of $1 trillion or so. But as you know, they're not going to stop with the spending. The Democrat majority here is not going to stop with the spending. They're going to be more they're going to try to get more of the Build Back Bankrupt plan through piecemeal or what have you. But last year's deficit was $2.8 trillion, obviously an abnormally high number under the disastrous American Rescue Plan. Do you think it's physically responsible to overspend by $1 trillion, even what they're projecting, even right now?
I mean, the deficit is large under current law, and that has important economic effects, right? That leads to higher interest rates and higher inflation, and that would, a wider deficit would make those challenges even greater.
During the State of the Union, the president said that to combat inflation, that businesses should just lower their costs, demonstrating, I think, a fiscal or economic illiteracy there. He's also accused them of price gouging. Businesses are just price gouging, and that's what's causing inflation. He and members of administration have said that. Do you think that do you hold the view that businesses are really kind of too dumb to understand that they should be trying every day to lower their costs, and they don't really do that? Or do you think that they don't understand that they compete by the lowest cost possible? Do you hold to that view that's been expressed by the president and some members of the administration?
So I would tell you our baseline projection assumes that businesses builds in the assumption that businesses are doing their best. They're trying to lower costs. They're trying to sell more and help their customers. And so we don't have price gouging in our baseline.
Thank you. I would think that you would, and I appreciate that answer on that. Do you think that can you confirm the overspending, does it contribute significantly to inflation in your view?
There I have to go back to what I said before, that it's a mix. It's the substantial demand, including from fiscal policy, together with the supply constraints.
Let me interject just for a second, because as you know, that the president's budget has proposed a massive increase over the next 10 years on spending. Admittedly, what is that going to do to inflation and prices going forward? And I'll just let you finish with that.
Okay, sure. Now I see the clock. I'll be quick. That we have inflation coming down in our forecast with fiscal constraint, with the actions of the Fed, and supply challenges waning. Deviations from that would feed into higher inflation. We haven't yet analyzed the president's budget. We will actually have that later in the summer. So, stay tuned.
Well, we look forward to that analysis. But thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Yep, the gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes. Unmute, please.
I did it again, as they say. Let me, Chairman.
I've already done it once during the hearing myself. So.
I did hear it, so I feel like I'm in good company. But But let me thank you for this hearing, and as well thank the budget director, Dr. Swagel. Let me indicate to my colleagues, I'm actually in the middle of a memorial for Uvalde. We are all overwhelmed here in Texas. So it is not that you live in Uvalde, it's that you live in Texas. And we're all broken, and we know the nation is praying for these families. So I thank you for yielding to me at this time. Dr. Swagel, I'm going to ask one answer questions so that I can get an overview of the direction in which I wish to go. First of all, let me ask the question, in your economic life, have you seen the economic impact of the pandemic? Have we been through in the last 50 years, short of wars, a pandemic of this sort where the economy was practically shut down?
The pandemic is unprecedented in our lifetimes.
So we're looking at an economy that is now in the midst of, or in the aftermath of, an unprecedented moment in history, and an economic unprecedented moment. Is that not, yes or no?
Oh, I think that's fair to say. Absolutely.
And then is the economy performing better than previously assumed in comparison to, as it relates to the baseline, in comparison to the February 2021 baseline?
Yes, the output is higher and the unemployment rate is lower than what CBO had previously had in our last update.
And that was before, that baseline was before the American Rescue Plan.
That's correct.
And so project on growth and employment now, are you assessing that they're more positive?
Yes, so as we have stronger economic growth, we have increased employment. There's also higher inflation, so the picture is complex. But the American Rescue Plan certainly contributed to stronger growth and stronger employment gains.
And have we had more jobs created in the last year? My understanding is 8.3 million jobs created since President Biden took office.
Oh, yeah, yes, that the rebound from the pandemic over the last year has meant again an unprecedented increase in employment in the U.S. economy.
Let me quickly move to history lane. One, the Bush tax cut that came after President Clinton, and now the tax cut that was done under President Trump. Did that create an increased deficit in spite of the celebratory attitude of my Republican friends? Did that Trump cut in particular create a deficit?
Yes, the CBO analysis from April 2018 goes into the fiscal and economic impacts of the 2017 Tax Act, and we had that as increasing the deficit.
The good news is that in 2022, we expect a $1 trillion deficit, down from 2.8 million in 2021.
That's right, down from $2.8 trillion. There's a $1.8 trillion decrease in the deficit from last year to the current year.
And in spite of the issue of inflation, which we are concerned about for my families, my working families, we're not ignoring it. The economy is moving along. What is your assessment?
So we have a continued recovery from the pandemic, that real economic growth and job creation is very strong with the tight labor market this year.
Let me just ask an employment question, and that is, we have jobs. Let me mix this with, have you given an assessment? So let me ask, I would like an assessment of a comprehensive immigration program, meaning legislation that Congress would have to plan for access to citizenship, for green cards, etc. Have you had that analysis? If not, I'm asking that analysis be done on a comprehensive immigration plan as to its infusion of dollars into the economy, and also employment. Would it impact employment negatively? Do we have jobs in the United States now?
Okay, no, it's an important question. So CBO did the fiscal analysis for the immigration provisions in the Build Back Better Act. That is narrow relative to your question because we focus on the fiscal impacts. It has been some time since CBO did the wider economic impact and the contributions of immigrants to the economy, to jobs, to culture and society, entrepreneurship, innovation. That's something we can do. We haven't done it for a while though.
Are you saying it would have a positive impact? I didn't get your point.
It would, yes. And this is CBO's past analysis has shown this, that immigrants contribute to the economy both economically, fiscally, through innovation, entrepreneurship. They create businesses, they hire other people. Their children make contributions, their grandchildren, and those are effects that CBO has analyzed in the past.
So, as President Biden, we have managed to survive a historic moment that we had never expected that we would be in. Dr. Swagel, and as my time closes, Dr. Swagel.
It's been absolutely an unprecedented moment. I'm in solid agreement with you.
The gentlewoman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Henson, for 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today. And I apologize if you're hearing some banging. We're finally having work done on our house 2 years after a major storm. So, Director, thanks so much for the work you do. The CBO obviously provides such an important role for us as members of Congress with the legislation that we're considering. And with the runaway spending coming out of this Congress, combined with the historically expensive proposals that we've seen from the Biden administration, I know you've had your work cut out. The baseline in front of us today makes it very clear. Under this administration, costs are on the rise. Our debt has surpassed $30 trillion. Interest rates are rising. Your baseline projection back in February of last year was a 2% average inflation. And as you know, we are well past that today. Democrats continue to say the solution to this is to just spend more money and grow government. Well, President Biden wants to spend another $4.9 trillion on the Build Back Better agenda. It's Build Back broke, and the out of control spending is why we're seeing the numbers in front of us today. I've held a town hall in each of the 20 counties that I represent in Iowa, and there was a common theme across all of Northeast Iowa. It's that rising costs are the number one concern that I hear from my constituents here in Iowa. Families are truly struggling to make ends meet, and we have to get our fiscal house in order. Working moms that have to choose right now between filling up their tank and putting food on the table, the restaurant owner who is seeing those chicken wings rise in price, double in price, and they have to pass that on to their customers. Grandparents are on a fixed income. They're worried about making rent, and those folks have been left behind by what's happening with our economy, which is, again, a direct result of the decisions made by the majority party in Congress and the president in the White House. When OMB Director Young testified in front of this committee on the president's budget, I asked her last year, were they thinking inflation was going to be transitory? She said yes, and they weren't considering the impact of inflation. Then I asked her this year how they're projecting 2.3% inflation in 2023 and beyond. And the administration believes that, again, it would be transient and did not need to be accounted for the longer term. Well, clearly it has not gone away. Your baseline does say that will continue into 2023, but what does CBO account for here as far as inflation goes that the administration is ignoring?
So our baseline is based on current law. So we have just the fiscal policy in place. Additional fiscal action would put additional upward pressure on inflation. And so that's the thing that we don't have.
So when you talk about this is a miscalculation, and I think the American people, and if a small business had to budget this way, they would be out of business. And so when I look at this miscalculation by OMB, it really does affect their ability to make accurate projections. And so that's a huge concern for me. So I would ask you, what measures of the economic outlook does inflation impact the most?
Oh, okay. No, it's an important question. So there's three measures. So first is on the spending side, there's both what we call the primary deficit. So spending on everything the federal government spends on. Social security benefits. I talked about jet fuel for the military. home healthcare aids, all the things that the federal government directly or indirectly spends on. Inflation raises the cost of that. Inflation raises the cost of the net interest payments as well. The government servicing its debt. Higher inflation means higher interest rates, higher payments to the federal government. Inflation does also mean more revenue. And so, because we tax essentially nominal incomes, inflation translates into higher revenues. The net the net shows that the interest rates are the danger. That higher inflation leads to a worsening deficit because of the higher interest rates and higher interest payments.
So because of these changes and fluctuations in the economy, they have, in essence, impacted your projections, I'm assuming, with your last baseline. So can you kind of delve into that a little bit, how those have changed?
Okay, no, absolutely. It's compared to, I'm just thinking about over the 10-year outlook. The 10-year outlook has gone from, it's just over 12 trillion to over 14.5 trillion. And so revenue has gone up. So this is, again, looking at it at 10 years, we see as revenue going up by more than it's like 3.4, an additional $3.4 trillion. Its outlays go up by more. And part of that is legislation. Part of that is the economic effects, such as higher inflation. And that's what's driving the increased deficits, going from 12 trillion to 14.5 trillion over the 10-year horizon.
All right. Thank you, Director. And I see I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. And Director Swagel, thank you for being here today. Thank you for talking to me earlier this year. In fact, the chairman mentioned that the budget that we have before us, the subject of this hearing, is late this year. He's described it as a little late. 3 months is probably significantly late in anyone else's book. Tell us again why the delay for the CBO baseline this year?
Okay, no, very good. So it's 3 different pieces to it. One was that we normally would have done an update in January. The people who would have done that were busy with the analysis on Build Back Better, and just between those 2 priorities, we could not do the update in January.
May I just interrupt you there?
Yeah, no, please.
It seems like that would be, if you were trying to properly price and project the cost of a major spending bill, a major spending reconciliation bill, you would at least want to have your baseline set, or you would at least prioritize the continued work on setting the baseline before you proceeded with another massive spending project, if you were truly concerned about the effect of, or the budgetary impacts of what you're doing. Would I be wrong to make that sort of assumption?
Of course, the latest information would be helpful, and we try to be as helpful as we can to policymakers. But that Build Back Better delay, that's the first of the 3 components to the delay that we faced. I can go into the other 2 if it's quickly.
Yeah, briefly.
Okay, yeah, very quickly I'll say. So the second is the fiscal year 22 appropriations, that those were delayed as well. And then the third is that the president's budget, the submission of that was delayed. And so as we get information on last year's actual spending when the president releases the budget. And so it's those three components pushed our baseline, our economic update back until yesterday.
So 2 on the White House and 1 on the Congress that kept you from being able to do your job. But when we spoke earlier in the year, you suggested to me that the strength of the economy going into the pandemic was much stronger than you had anticipated. Did I understand that correctly?
That is correct. That the economy in early 2021, as compared to the forecast we put out in early 2021, the economy is stronger, that people are coming back into the labor market, and the impact of the fiscal policy that had been undertaken, I think it was more impactful than we understood at the time.
And just to be clear, this is fiscal 2021. So actually starting October 1st of 2020.
That's right. I'm thinking of the CAA, Appropriations Act that was enacted at the end of 2020 had essentially more economic impact payments, the rebate checks, put back some expanded unemployment insurance, and some other things like that.
Another thing you related to me was that the amount of tax collections were stronger than you had anticipated. And it looks like from your report that you're delivering us today that has continued. Is that correct?
That's right. That continues to be the case. It's both from the economy is stronger. There's some timing shifts that, the pandemic legislation, delayed some taxes. So we're seeing some of that come back now. Even beyond that, tax revenue.
So let me ask you this: when you report a reduction in the deficit, is that largely because the strength of the income tax collections were stronger than what you'd anticipated?
It's a mix that compared to our previous analysis.
But how much of that mix was increased tax revenues? We were all told that this was $1 trillion giveaway to the millionaires and billionaires, according to Chairman Sanders. So what's the deal here?
So I'll tell you, if you compare the projection we made in 2020 for 2022, right? So we're saying it's $1 trillion is what we're saying now. We previously thought it'd be 1.2 trillion, and that's the mix. That revenue is about $400 billion stronger than we anticipated. Spending
it's an important number, $400 billion stronger. I mean, that's pretty significant. Look, do you stress test this stuff? We require banks to stress test their projections, their balance sheets. Does any of your modeling require stress testing of what is happening to the United States economy with the spending of the Biden administration?
No, absolutely. And it's something that we think about. I think about what could go wrong. And we've done some of this work. We had recent work that we did for Senator Crapo and the Finance Committee on what's the fiscal effect of higher inflation. We looked at 2 different scenarios. We're continuing to do some of that. What's the effect of higher inflation and higher interest rates? What would it mean for the economy? And what would it mean for the fiscal situation? I'm hopeful that we'll have more on that later this year.
Well, I hope to follow up with you on that. Thank you very much for your testimony today.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Obernolte, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Swagel, thank you for the update on the outlook. I'd like to talk about some of the alternative policy solutions that you have examined in the outlook and how those fit into the long-term budgetary and economic outlook that the CBO issued a few months ago. Now, in the long-term outlook, if I am recalling correctly, you expressed some grave concerns that by the end of the forecast period on the path that we were on, that net interest outlays would exceed 8% of GDP, would consume over half of all federal tax revenue, and that if interest rates increased in response to inflation, that would get much worse, and that sometime between now and then, something would have to be done to get the deficit under control. Am I understanding that right?
No, that's right. That the fiscal trajectory is challenging now, but the further we go out, it gets more challenging. And we'll have another update of that of the 30-year horizon later this summer. I'm hoping in July. It'll get more difficult, honestly. But we'll
okay, so in this outlook that we're discussing in this hearing, you examine a couple of different policy alternatives, and you analyze their impacts on the deficit. And you've got a table that summarizes it, the ones that increase the deficit, the ones that reduce the deficit. Can you tell me which of those policy scenarios actually have a result in a declining deficit over the course of the forecast period?
So we did we did a range of alternative scenarios, some with higher spending and some with lower spending. One of the ones that has a lower path of spending freezes appropriations at the current level, and that reduces the deficit. We looked just at that looks at just appropriations, which of course is not the biggest part of the deficit challenge.
Yeah, discretionary spending, I think you call it in the.
Exactly.
Okay, but if I'm reading it right, although it reduced the deficit over the baseline, it did not reduce the deficit on an absolute basis. Is that correct?
No, that is correct.
Okay, so let me ask again, which of these, on an absolute basis, which of the policy scenarios that you've laid out here in the outlook actually reduce the deficit in, on an absolute basis?
Okay, I mean, so one other one we did here, I'll mention two things. One we did in this report, and then one we'll have later, by the end of the year, is we looked at the spending in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That by the budget rules, that gets extended out through the budget window. There's a box on page 77 of the report, it's box 3-4, that goes through and shows the fiscal impact of that. And it's just mechanical through the budget rules. And so if that doesn't get extended, that would be substantial enough to reduce the budget deficit. That is not the long-term.
Not on an absolute basis, though. That change, if I'm understanding right, would not result in the budget deficit decreasing over time instead of increasing. Is that right?
That is correct. Absolutely.
Okay, so here's the crux of what I'm asking here is, why are we not examining policy alternatives that result in an overall decline in deficit instead of an increase in deficit over time, if, as you say, we should be so concerned about this increasing deficit?
No, I agree. It's a grave concern, and we will have that for you later this year. So it's probably December, we will have a new edition of our budget options volume that goes through a wide range of policies, and we will provide information on policies that change the course, instead of just change the shape of the river, that really make a big impact on the deficit. Right.
Okay. Well, I mean, I wish that every outlook that you gave us with these policy alternatives would include those alternatives, just to illustrate the gravity of the problem and the magnitude of the changes that are going to be required to affect, that trajectory. So, along those lines, let me ask about something Congressman Feenstra mentioned, the trust fund and the declining balances in the trust funds. And you go over that in page 125 and 126 of your outlook. You say that the outlook was prepared under the assumption that mandatory spending would continue regardless of the balance in the trust funds. But you also say on the previous page that the government has no legal authority to continue to expend anything when the balance of the trust funds is exhausted, other than the revenue that's coming in. So those two statements are in tension, and I'm wondering, why do we do it that way? Because we're saying we're contradicting ourselves, in the span of one page.
No, I agree. There is a tension there, and we are following the budget rules, and in some sense that's why it's tables B1 and B2 around the chapter that you showed. It is trying to provide that information, and it's the Deficit Control Act that requires us to do it that way. And so we're trying to provide as complete information as we can, follow the law, and then provide the additional information to show the impact of that tension that you mentioned.
All right. Well, I would encourage you to do that in the future. I see my time has expired, but please, in the previous outlook, you had made plain that just attacking discretionary spending is not going to be sufficient to solve this problem, and that it's vital. Regardless of your political party or political stance, it's going to be vital for us to get this under control. So we're going to have to take a look at those trust funds and what we're going to do as those balances decline and are exhausted. And I'd like to encourage you to please include those scenarios. As uncomfortable as that conversation might be, please include those scenarios in future outlooks. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here. I do have to shake my head that there's been a lot of celebration of $1 trillion deficit. So I want to say I am not celebrating that we are at $1 trillion deficit, which is one of the highest deficits we've ever had. So only in Washington. But I wanted to first ask you, as we talk about the issue of inflation, and it's the multitude of impacts it has. We talk about the fact that the Fed is now, in an effort to combat inflation, begun raising interest rates, and expectations they will continue to do so. So the CBO projects that net interest payments on the debt will be 8.1 trillion over 10 years, and that would be 1.9 trillion higher than than previously, or due to the increase in inflation that's projected. So that, in my mind, is money that's essentially wasted because we have to pay because the rate inflation increases. I'm also wondering, as we talk about inflation, and certainly our priority as representatives is the price that our citizens are incurring when they go to the pump, when they go to the grocery store, et cetera. But what is the delta, if you have one, on the increased cost on running our government and the cost that the government has on buying everything now due to this inflation that if inflation was at its previous level several years ago, we wouldn't have had to endure?
No, it's an important one, and the U.S. government buys a wide range of goods and services. It pays salaries, it buys jet fuel, buys everything, and so that has an important impact on spending. There is a revenue impact as well, since the tax code is based on nominal wages, and then net interest payments go up. So the inflation has an important impact on the government. We haven't, I guess we haven't looked at just that in isolation. We've looked at the net of all these things.
Yeah. Just back on the certainly related to the two things of inflation and the interest rate increases. Given the most recent economic data, what do you feel the likelihood of a recession is later this year or next year?
Okay, so we don't have a recession in our projection. That today the challenge in some senses is that demand is too strong relative to supply, right? It's both supply and demand, but we have very strong demand. Now, of course, as the Fed tightens, we've seen the impact already in financial markets, and wealth is down. And of course, there's always the possibility of a recession. We don't have that in our projection, but we try to be in the middle of the range of possibilities. And so certainly at one side is the possibility.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. And now it's up to me. I yield myself 10 minutes for my questions and comments. And first of all, once again, Dr. Swagel, thanks so much for being here and for your responsiveness and the information. One thing that I think may be important to have as a part of the record is for you to briefly explain what this forecast, what this outlook is used for, why it's important. And there's also, I kind of inferred a sense that some members, particularly on the Republican side, think that you work for Democrats because there was some pronouns, and maybe the pronouns were used accidentally, but talking just in general about this process and why it's so important and what its purpose is.
No, thank you. So we serve the Congress. We work for for both chambers and both sides. So we're nonpartisan, and we work through the budget committees and for the chairs and ranking members of committees of jurisdiction. The baseline update once the budget committees adopt the work as a new baseline, provides a foundation for policymakers to look at the impact of fiscal policy, whether on spending or on revenue. So that's why we do it the way we do it. We try to look ahead under current law as best we can so that you have the foundation on which to evaluate fiscal policy.
And I know you constantly give disclaimers about the uncertainty of these projections. I remember several years ago when Tim Geithner was Secretary of the Treasury and appeared before the committee. And I think Paul Ryan was chairman at that point. And I asked, he was showing all these charts going out to 2075 and so forth. And I asked the secretary at that point, how reliable, given the pace of change in the world and all the dynamics that are involved in the world economy, how reliable do you think projections going out 30, 40, 50 years are? And he said to me, I don't think projections going out more than 5 years are reliable. And so I just want, when we're talking about these 10 years, I know you have to do it, but would you agree that there's a great variation in the possibilities related relative to your projections at this point.
No, absolutely. And as you said, as Secretary Geithner said, the difficulty, it grows, as we go out over time. And we understand that, we acknowledge that. I mean, even, nominal dollars, comparing a dollar in year 10 against a dollar in year 1, right? We do it because that's useful to the Congress. But of course, policymakers understand that, 10 years from now is different than this year. The other thing we do also is we keep the baseline, the baseline constant, just so that you have a constant benchmark that, as I said before, we know our inflation forecast is too low, right? I mean, we locked it in the beginning of March, subsequent events showed it was higher. We're still going to keep the baseline, the economic projection constant, so that there's this is a consistent benchmark to evaluate all proposals, both sides, both chambers. That's the key to what we do, is to be consistent, so that you and your colleagues can evaluate the merits or not of legislation.
Thank you. I want to talk about inflation for a little bit, because I think we hear these numbers, 8.3%, the most recent one. Your projections for this year a little bit lower than that. And the comment made, it's a $5,000 tax increase for the average family. Well, it really depends on what the average family does and how what it's composed of. I mean, the impact of inflation on a family of 6 or 8 is a lot different than the impact on a family of 2. Food prices are different. If you're going to, at one point, I know that it was estimated that a third of the inflation rate was due to the price of used cars, the growth. Well, if you're not buying a car, that portion of the inflation rate doesn't affect you. So it's really kind of, it's individual circumstances that are going to determine the impact of increased prices on everyone. Now, we know everybody eats and food prices are up, and we have to respond to these as we can. But we generalize because that's what we do. But one of the questions, I know, for instance, everybody's saying, well, the price of eggs have gone up. Well, they had to kill 5 million hens because of the avian flu. That's not anything had to do with anybody's policy, right? That was an unfortunate act of nature that resulted in the price of eggs. When the pandemic started, lumber manufacturers stopped producing lumber because they thought there wouldn't be a demand for it. Well, it turns out there was a huge demand for it. They weren't supplying it. The price of lumber went up 5 or 6 times. Now it's come back down to about a third of its highest level. But all of these components make it really difficult to not just to figure out what happened to cause the inflation, but also to deal with it, because a lot of it's the actual marketplace and decisions that producers made. The shipment of computer chips and so forth impacted a lot. But Republicans want to say that the American Rescue Plan was largely responsible for this. And my question is, have you done any analysis of to what extent the American Rescue Plan contributed to inflation? You said it was a factor, and but have you done any analysis of to what extent it was a factor?
No, so we haven't, and we haven't tried to parcel that out, between the mix of demand, the strong demand and strong, not strong, the opposite of strong, the supply impediments. And it's both, and that's one of the challenges. That there's so many things going on, changes in the economy and the labor market, from health and scientific reasons with the virus, and we have not disentangled that. At some point in the future, people will go back and disentangle that. And
right. Well, some have. I mean, I think Moody's Analytics said it was about a 0.5% or 1/3% of the total of inflation. The Fed in San Francisco came up with a similar number. I think Goldman Sachs came up with less than 1%. And Larry Summers predicted that, is now taking credit for having predicted this inflation rate based on the American Rescue Plan. But he basically said there was a third possibility it would be significant inflation, a third that it would be moderate, and a third it would be none. So he tried to cover his bases totally at the time, and now he's taking credit for it. But there are not a lot of economists who are saying that it's the lion's share of the inflation that we're seeing now. And what people tend to forget is that about 25% of the American Rescue Plan was essentially a tax cut. It was $1,400 checks to almost every citizen in the country. In every congressional district, on average, there was sent by the federal government $900 million of disposable income. And I think we can argue over whether that was justified or not, or whether it was needed or not. But I don't think many of the millions, hundreds of millions of Americans who got that $1,400 check sent it back. They were very grateful for it. And I think you can make a strong case that that had played a large role in actually helping the economy recover, saving businesses all over the country and saving lives. And the other thing I would say is that I'll ask you for this. We talk about deficits, and obviously we can argue about how bad they are, what we need to do to resolve them, whether we do. But by and large, isn't it true that when the government runs a deficit, that the American people run a surplus?
Oh, I see. I mean, right. The government is running the deficit, and the funds are going somewhere. So in some sense, the American Rescue Plan Act was an illustration of that contributed to a wider deficit, and that was used for a variety of purposes. The rebate checks to American families, combating the virus, unemployment insurance, and aid for state and local governments. Right. So in some sense, that's absolutely, the money is is recycled is a good term here, used throughout the economy.
When the government runs a surplus, it's taking money out of the economy, and therefore from people. When it runs a deficit, it is putting money into the economy and into people's pockets. And the question is, what other impacts does that have? And that's obviously what we're trying to discuss here. But I'm not going to use the last 20 seconds, except once again to thank you for being here today. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your responses today. And we look forward to hearing from you again in the not so distant future. Unless there's any further business, this hearing is adjourned.